If you could hear the conversations happening inside your own mind, you would understand exactly why your life feels the way it feels, because your destiny isn't being shaped by the world around you. It's being shaped by the whisper within you. For 3 days, if you chose to speak with intention, with clarity, with boldness, your life would begin to shift in ways you never imagined. Not because magic happens in 72 hours, but because momentum does. You've spent years speaking to yourself without even noticing. You're saying, I can't. I'm not enough. I always mess up. Nothing ever works out for me. And you believe those words, not because they were true, but because you repeated them. The mind accepts repetition as reality if you tell yourself the same story long enough. It becomes the script you live by. But the moment you change the conversation, you change the direction of your life. For the next 3 days, speak to yourself like someone who is becoming, not someone who is breaking. Talk to yourself like someone has somewhere to go. Talk to yourself like someone who refuses to stay trapped in the same chapter forever. Your inner dialogue is the most powerful coach you will ever have, or the most destructive critic you will ever face. And the crazy part is you choose which one it becomes. Your life follows your language. When you tell yourself, I'm done settling, you start to rise. When you say, I'm capable of more, you begin to see opportunities you used to overlook. When you declare, I'm stepping into my purpose, you start walking with a confidence that surprises even you. This isn't fantasy. This is focus, this is alignment, this is you rewriting a narrative that was never designed to hold you back. 3 days of intentional inner dialogue can break cycles that years of fear have built. Day one, your mind resists because it's used to the old script. You'll hear thoughts trying to drag you back into doubt, but you answer them. You speak louder. Day two, something begins to shift. You catch the negativity quicker. You correct it faster. Your thoughts begin to follow your voice. Day three, you feel momentum, a spark, a sense of authority rising in you. You start believing what you're saying because you finally hear yourself clearly. Talk to yourself like the person you want to become. Tell yourself, I'm worthy of good things. Tell yourself, I can rise from this. Tell yourself, I'm building a future that reflects my true self. Speak until the words settle into your spirit. Speak until your doubts lose their grip. Speak until your confidence starts to awaken. You're not lying to yourself. You're reminding yourself of what fear tried to make you forget. Stop waiting for someone else to inspire you. Stop waiting for circumstances to align before you believe in yourself. Stop waiting for the world to clap before you take a step forward. You have the power to ignite your own transformation with your own voice. Your breakthrough begins when your language changes. Your healing begins when your language changes. Your future begins when your language changes. For 3 days, talk to yourself with the same passion you've used to encourage others. For 3 days, speak life into your own heart. For 3 days, declare the future you want, not the past you've survived. Because the moment you master your inner dialogue, you begin shaping a life that finally matches the greatness inside you. Your inner voice is the architect of your destiny because every action you take, every risk you embrace, and every opportunity you pursue begins first as a whisper inside your mind. Before your feet ever move, your thoughts go ahead of you, laying the foundation for what becomes possible. That quiet voice inside you is not just commentary. It is construction. It builds beliefs, shapes identity, and sets the direction of your life long before you see any physical evidence of change. Most people don't realize that their inner voice has been designing their path for years. The words you repeatedly speak to yourself become the blueprint from which your life is built. If you tell yourself you're capable, you start to search for chances to prove it. If you tell yourself you're unworthy, you unconsciously sabotage opportunities that could elevate you. The inner voice doesn't simply reflect who you are. It actually forms who you become. The challenge is that many of us inherited an inner voice shaped by fear, scarcity, trauma, or the opinions of others, long before we had a chance to choose our own narrative. Someone else's words became the soundtrack in our minds. A teacher who doubted you, a parent who compared you, a friend who dismissed your dreams. Those moments echo louder than most people realize, and without ever questioning them, you begin to live by them. You follow a script you never wrote, and your destiny quietly bends to a story that doesn't belong to you. But the moment you become aware of the power of your inner dialogue, you reclaim the pen. You begin to see that you are not trapped by your past, you are shaped by your present conversation. Your inner voice influences your courage. When you want to step into something new, fear will always present itself. But what determines whether you freeze or move is not the size of the fear, but the strength of the voice speaking back to it. Some people never take the leap not because they lack skill or opportunity, but because their inner voice has convinced them that the leap is not theirs to take. Others succeed not because they are more talented, but because they learn to say, I belong here, even when their knees were shaking. That quiet sentence is enough to shift the entire trajectory of a life. Your inner voice shapes your resilience when life hits hard, and it will. What determines whether you rise again is not the circumstance, but the internal conversation that follows the fall. One person fails and says, this is the end of me. Another fails and says, this is the beginning of something better. Both experience the same blow, but only one builds something stronger in its aftermath. Resilience isn't built in muscles or strategy, it's built in language. Your inner voice frames your vision. You cannot reach for what you cannot imagine, and you will not imagine what you have already told yourself is out of reach. If your inner dialogue is filled with limitation, you will only see closed doors. If your inner dialogue is filled with possibility, doors begin to appear where walls used to be. The internal architect drafts the future long before reality paints it. Your destiny expands or shrinks to the size of the voice within you. The world outside may try to define you, but the world inside determines the direction you choose next. When you master that voice, you begin to design a life that reflects who you truly are rather than who you were told to be. What you repeatedly speak becomes what you eventually believe, because the mind is trained through repetition, not intention. You can desire confidence, hope, or courage, but if the language you use daily contradicts those desires, your mind will always follow the words, not the wish. Every phrase you speak to yourself forms grooves in your thinking, patterns that deepen each time you repeat them. Over time, those grooves become mental highways, automatic routes your thoughts travel without effort. This is why a single negative thought doesn't break you, but a repeated one becomes a belief that quietly shapes your identity. The story you tell yourself every day eventually becomes the story you live. When you speak something often enough, your mind begins to treat it as truth. You might start by saying, I'm not good enough, almost casually, perhaps after a mistake or a moment of insecurity. But say it again tomorrow and the next day, and soon it becomes more than a reaction. It becomes a reality your mind accepts. You begin to behave in alignment with that belief. You shrink from opportunities. You hesitate when you should step forward, and you settle for less because your inner dialogue has convinced you that less is all you deserve. This shift doesn't happen dramatically. It happens quietly, slowly, invisibly through the power of repeated words. The same principle works in reverse. If you speak strength often enough, your mind begins to search for evidence of it. If you speak purpose often enough, your vision begins to sharpen. If you speak possibility often enough, hope begins to rise even in situations that look impossible. Words are not magic, but they are seeds. Give them time, and they grow into the beliefs that shape your identity, your habits, and ultimately your destiny. The human mind is always listening, even when you aren't aware of what you're saying. When you criticize yourself, your subconscious accepts it. When you undermine yourself, your confidence absorbs it. When you downplay your worth, your spirit bows to it. People often don't need enemies because the voice inside becomes the loudest opposition they face. But when you begin to speak intentionally, when you replace I can't with I'm learning, or I'm broken with I'm healing, or I'm quantum with I'm becoming, your subconscious begins to rewire itself. New pathways form, new beliefs take shape. New behaviors follow naturally because your mind aligns with the words you consistently feed it. This is why encouragement from others feels powerful but temporary. Someone may tell you that you're capable, gifted, or resilient, and you'll feel uplifted for a moment. But if your own voice contradicts theirs, the external affirmation fades quickly. Their words cannot outpower your inner language. For a belief to take root, it must be repeated by the person living the life, not the person observing it. Self-talk is not about hype or pretending everything is perfect. It's about choosing words that build rather than break, strengthen rather than sabotage, align rather than scatter your mind. What you repeatedly speak becomes what you eventually believe, because repetition creates familiarity, and the mind trusts what feels familiar, even if it's painful, even if it limits you, even if it contradicts who you truly are. Familiar words become mental truths. This is why transforming your life begins with transforming your language. If you want to expand your potential, expand your vocabulary around yourself. If you want to rise, speak words that lift. If you want to change your beliefs, change the phrases that echo in the silence when nobody else is speaking. We're told to be. Your inner dialogue can lift you higher or lock you down, because every thought you entertain becomes a silent force that either carries you forward or weighs you to the ground. Long before you ever take a step toward your goals, your inner dialogue decides whether you're allowed to move. It is the gatekeeper of your confidence, the shaper of your self-worth, and the quiet judge of what you deserve. It operates in the background, and yet it influences everything from the risks you take to the love you accept to the dreams you dare to pursue. When your inner dialogue lifts you, you experience momentum. When it locks you down, you feel trapped in a cage with the door wide open, but the belief that you're not allowed to walk through. Every achievement begins with a thought, I can do this. Every moment of progress starts with a whisper of permission. I belong here. When your inner dialogue is empowering, it becomes a source of strength you can lean on. It becomes the voice that tells you to try again after failure. It becomes the voice that reminds you of who you are when life tries to strip you of your identity. It becomes the voice that encourages you to rise, to stretch, to reach for something greater than the life you've settled for. People often talk about motivation as if it comes from some external source, but true motivation begins internally. It's born from the messages you repeat to yourself when the world is quiet and no one is watching. But your inner dialogue can also be the chain that binds you. It can convince you that you're incapable, unworthy, or destined for disappointment. A single thought of doubt spoken repeatedly within yourself becomes a barrier stronger than the obstacles outside of you. And the most dangerous part is that inner limitations often appear logical. I'm not ready. I don't have enough. What if I fail? These thoughts feel responsible, cautious, even reasonable. But beneath them lies fear disguised as wisdom. And fear, when given a voice long enough, does not simply influence your decisions. It controls them. It locks you down by narrowing your possibilities until your world becomes smaller, not because it has to be, but because your mind is afraid to expand. Your inner dialogue determines not only what you reach for, but how you interpret every experience. Two people can face the same setback. One says, "This is a sign I should stop," while the other says, "This is part of the process." One interpretation shuts the door, the other opens a path, the same event, the same circumstance, but the inner dialogue chooses the meaning, and the meaning shapes the outcome. Your life is often not a reflection of your situation, but a reflection of the story you tell yourself about the situation. When your inner dialogue aligns with growth, you begin to see challenges as opportunities, setbacks as preparation, and discomfort as the birthplace of strength. You approach life with the belief that you are capable of rising above whatever stands in front of you. On the other hand, when your inner dialogue aligns with fear or limitation, you interpret difficulties as signs that you should shrink. You view obstacles as evidence that you're not enough. You see discomfort as a threat rather than a teacher. The power of your inner dialogue lies in its ability to transform the invisible into the inevitable. If the voice inside you speaks life, strength, and possibility, you begin to move in ways that lift you into new levels of growth. But if the voice inside you speaks doubt, fear, and defeat, it will quietly chain you to the same level no matter how much potential you carry. Conscious self-talk for 72 hours creates mental momentum because the mind responds quickly to intentional direction when it is consistent and uninterrupted. Most people don't realize how chaotic and undisciplined their internal conversations have become. Thoughts fire off randomly, influenced by anxiety habits, past experiences, and old fears. But when you take control of that internal language, even for a short concentrated period, something powerful begins to shift. Your mind starts to follow the lead of your words rather than dragging you through familiar cycles of doubt. Those first 72 hours become the ignition point for a deeper transformation because repetition with awareness creates speed, clarity, and emotional velocity. The average person speaks to themselves hundreds of times a day without noticing. Much of that talk is reactive, criticizing mistakes, anticipating problems, remembering disappointments, or predicting negative outcomes. This type of unconscious self-talk builds momentum as well, but it's momentum in the wrong direction. You may find yourself stuck in the same emotional patterns, not because life refuses to change, but because your internal dialogue reinforces the very state you're trying to escape. Conscious self-talk interrupts the cycle. It's the moment you stop letting your thoughts run wild and begin steering them with purpose. For 72 hours, you become the author instead of the audience. During the first day of intentional self-talk, the shift feels subtle. You catch yourself mid-thought and replace phrases like "I can't" with "I'm capable," or "I always mess up" with "I'm learning and improving." The immediate effect may not feel dramatic, but your brain is already responding. Cognitive patterns begin to reroute. Neural pathways associated with negative self-beliefs start losing strength while new pathways begin forming. This is the forming stage of momentum, the mental equivalent of taking those first steps at the start of a long distance run. They feel small, but they set the tone. By the second day, something deeper begins to happen. You become more aware of how often your mind tries to drift back into old patterns. You notice negative thoughts faster, interrupt them quicker, and correct them with more confidence. You start to realize how many limits you've been placing on yourself. Without question, conscious self-talk becomes a practice. And with practice comes acceleration. Your energy shifts. Your emotional state begins to align with your new language. You feel a growing sense of strength, not because your circumstances changed, but because your perspective is changing from within. By the third day, momentum becomes undeniable. The words you intentionally speak begin to feel natural instead of forced. Confidence starts to rise, clarity sharpens, doubt still whispers, but it no longer dictates. You start to think differently, behave differently, and carry yourself with a different level of certainty. This is momentum. The mind moving in a new direction with increasing ease and decreasing resistance. It becomes harder to return to old patterns because you've spent 72 hours training your mind to follow a new command. Mental momentum is not mystical. It is the result of consistent repetition. Just like the body gains strength through repeated movement, the mind gains resilience through repeated truth. Conscious self-talk for 72 hours is enough to disrupt deeply rooted habits and enough to begin forming new ones. It teaches your brain what voice to trust, your empowered voice, not your fearful one. And once momentum begins, your thoughts start to work for you rather than against you. Affirmation isn't hype because it is rooted in the science of how the brain forms beliefs, habits, and emotional reactions. Many people dismiss affirmations as empty positivity or motivational noise, but they are actually a direct tool for reshaping the subconscious patterns that govern how you think, feel, and behave. The subconscious mind does not differentiate between reality and repeated suggestion. It accepts what is consistently fed to it. And over time, it aligns your emotions, decisions, and actions with those internal messages. Affirmation is simply the act of intentionally feeding your mind the truths you wanted to believe rather than the fears or assumptions it has absorbed from past experiences. Affirmation becomes powerful when you understand that most of your internal dialogue is inherited, not chosen. You absorb messages from childhood, from the environment you grew up in, from moments that molded you, from people who didn't understand your potential, and from failures you never healed from. These messages planted themselves deeply, quietly shaping the beliefs you carry into adulthood. Some of those beliefs serve you, but many work against you, convincing you that you're not enough, that you will always struggle, or that success is for others, but not for you. Affirmation challenges those internal narratives. It is not pretending that everything is perfect. It is confronting the part of your mind that is still living by old stories and teaching it a new one. When you speak an affirmation repeatedly, you are doing more than saying words. You are interrupting a neural pattern. The brain loves familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. If you are used to thinking in terms of fear, scarcity, or self-doubt, the brain will return to those thoughts automatically. Affirmation introduces a different pattern, one that may feel uncomfortable at first because it is new, but with repetition, the brain begins to adapt. Neural pathways strengthen around the new belief. Emotional responses shift. Internal resistance weakens. What once felt forced begins to feel natural, and what once felt untrue begins to feel possible. Affirmations also influence the way you perceive opportunities and obstacles. When your self-talk aligns with limitation, You overlook chances for growth because your mind filters them out. You subconsciously seek reinforcement for the beliefs you already hold, even if those beliefs diminish you. But when your self-talk aligns with possibility, you become more aware of opportunities that were always there, but invisible through the lens of self-doubt. You begin to take risks you once avoided. You begin to see progress where you once expected failure. You interpret setbacks as temporary rather than defining, and you respond to challenges with problem solving instead of panic. Affirmation changes your perception, and perception changes your decisions. Emotionally, affirmations help stabilize the inner world. The body reacts to your thoughts with physical responses: stress, tension, fear, or calm, strength, and clarity. When you repeatedly affirm peace, resilience, or confidence, your emotional state gradually reflects those qualities. This is not hype, it is neurological conditioning. You are training your emotional responses the same way someone trains a muscle. Over time, you become less reactive to fear, less overwhelmed by uncertainty, and more grounded in your sense of identity. Affirmations also strengthen identity, which is the foundation of every choice you make. People act according to who they believe they are. If your identity is built on insecurity, your actions will reflect insecurity. If your identity is built on strength, your actions will reflect strength. Affirmation reinforces identity by anchoring you to the truth of who you are becoming rather than the memory of who you once were. Transformation begins the moment your language changes, because the words you use shape the way your mind interprets your reality. Language is not just communication, it is construction. It builds meaning, forms beliefs, and sets the emotional tone through which you navigate the world. When you shift the words you use to describe yourself, your circumstances, and your future, you begin to shift the direction of your life. Most people try to change their actions without changing the language that drives those actions, and that's why they stay stuck. True transformation happens inside first, and language is the switch that turns on a new internal system. Every belief you hold is anchored in words, words you were told, words you repeated, words you accepted. If you grew up hearing language of criticism or limitation, you internalized that vocabulary and built your life around it. If you were surrounded by fear-based language, you learned to navigate life through fear. Your internal dictionary becomes the framework through which you interpret everything. When you change that dictionary, when you replace words of defeat with words of possibility, you alter the lens through which you perceive yourself. That shift in perception becomes the spark that ignites new behavior. When your language changes, your identity begins to evolve. If you constantly say, "I'm not capable," or "I'm unlucky," or "things never work out for me," you reinforce an identity rooted in limitation. But if you start speaking in terms of growth, "I'm learning, I'm improving, I'm becoming stronger," you reshape the way you see yourself. And the way you see yourself determines the choices you make. Language is the bridge between who you are and who you can become. When you speak differently, you start acting differently because your mind follows your words. Changing your language also alters your emotional state. Words carry emotional weight. They trigger neurological responses that influence your mood, energy, and motivation. The language of hopelessness creates heaviness. The language of possibility creates momentum. When you shift from saying, "I'm overwhelmed," to "I'm managing it step by step," your nervous system responds with a different emotional signal. When you stop saying, "I'm failing," and start saying, "I'm progressing," your mind releases a different level of strength. Emotional transformation begins with linguistic transformation because the body reacts to the story the mind tells. Your language also shapes your expectations. When you describe your future with hesitation or doubt, you unconsciously lower your standards and shrink your vision. But when you start speaking about your future with clarity and confidence, your expectations rise. And when expectations rise, effort increases. You take actions you once avoided. You make decisions you once feared. You position yourself for opportunities you once overlooked. A person who says, "Something good is coming," behaves differently from a person who says, "Nothing ever works for me." One walks with anticipation, the other walks with resignation. Language directs expectation, and expectation directs destiny. When your language changes, even the way you handle obstacles transforms. The old language might say, "This is the end," but the new language says, "This is part of the process." The old language interprets setbacks as failure. The new language interprets them as feedback. With a shift in language, the same event produces completely different response. That shift in response is what creates resilience. And resilience is what builds long-term transformation. Ultimately, transformation begins the moment your language changes, because language is the instruction manual for your mind. It tells your brain what to look for, how to interpret experiences, and how to respond to challenges. When you choose words that empower rather than diminish you, your inner world reorganizes itself around those words, and your outer world eventually mirrors the change.